Right. Well, good afternoon to all of you. It's still morning where I am. I'm in California at the moment. So I'm Tracey King-Ortega, and I serve as regional liaison for Central America through World Mission of the Presbyterian Church USA. So what does that mean? And maybe I'll back up before I start about what I currently do, just some broad strokes of kind of what got me to this place. And the reason I think I want to start with that is because I think it's trips that you all are going to be participating in and those kinds of partnerships that really brought meaning to my life and kind of drew me to this path that I'm on now, which has been a while now. I've been in this role since 2005, but I first moved to Nicaragua in 1999 is when I started working with CEPAD. But before that, in college, I went to a Presbyterian college over on the West Coast in Washington State, Whitworth College. And my sophomore year there, I spent a semester traveling through Central America, learning about the history, the current context, social, economic, political situation of the country. And it really sparked something in me of the importance of understanding how the world is interconnected. And that what goes on in the US impacts people around the world. And being aware of that and trying to understand that was important to me. But then also those cross-cultural relationships of understanding other perspectives, other life experiences than my own has broadened my understanding. It has deepened my faith. It has allowed me to understand God in different ways. And so I think as I've felt called to continue engaging in God's mission, it's always been along those lines of, to some degree in my work, of facilitating those kinds of experiences for other people. So that's an important part of my role. It has been, and it continues to be. So when I first moved to Nicaragua in 1999, it was to work directly with CEPAD in their partnerships and delegation program. And it was in those early years that I first, there was some spring break trips from Davidson College. And then DCPC also began making trips around those years that I was, working in Nicaragua. And so I did that for about 4.5 years. And it was really enriching to be helping to be that bridge to help facilitate those transformational experiences for folks in the US and help build that understanding across cultures and realities. And then I wrapped that up and I was done working for the church and was on to different things. And I went to graduate school and got a degree in conflict transformation from Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. When I wrapped up that degree, I realized that Central America was still calling to me. And so this position that I'm currently in, regional liaison for Central America, opened up right about the time I was graduating with my master's degree. And so it just felt like a really good opportunity to bring forth my studies in conflict transformation along with my history and love for Central America. And so I started in this role in July of 2005. So that's been 18 years, if my math is correct, I think, coming up on 18 years in this role. And so as regional liaison, I understand my role I have 3 major facets to my work. The first is to serve as as a support for our mission coworkers in Central America. With my region of Central America, though normally when we talk about Central America, we include Guatemala, we have someone else who does Guatemala and Mexico. So I work with Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras. And so we have mission coworkers in all 4 of those countries. And so I help support them in the work that they do. And then in my second role is as a liaison, as the title says, to our partners. So as the Presbyterian Church, we do mission and partnership. So we aren't going to other places and just deciding what needs to be done and doing it, but we are invited in through long-term relationships that we've had. And so my role as regional liaison is to foster and develop those relationships and to keep those alive. In Nicaragua, it's quite easy because we have been in, CEPAD is just celebrated their 50 years. And as the Presbyterian Church, we've been connected to them essentially throughout all of those 50 years. So it's a very long-standing, important relationship, both for them and for us. And then the third role I play is as a resource for U.S. Presbyterians who are interested in or already engaged in mission work in Central America, so that we can engage in healthy ways, because there's some really unhealthy models out there that we try to avoid. And so I try to, provide information, my knowledge, and spaces for reflection to think about doing how we're doing those kinds of things. So that's kind of the broad strokes of who I am. I moved to Nicaragua in 1999 when I worked with CEPAD, obviously. And then when I became regional liaison in 2005, I moved back to Nicaragua and lived there up until about, well, I guess we're coming up on 5 years now. In 2018, my family and I came up to California during some of the civil unrest that was happening in Nicaragua in April of 2018. We came up in June. And we can, if you want to get into those things, we can get into that in a little bit later. But so I've been based in California since then. This has just been a better place for the stability of my children. I have my kids are currently, I have a 6th grader, a 6th grade girl, and twin 4th graders. So they're in school here, and we're living in my mom's house. I'm back in my childhood bedroom, and my kids walk to the elementary school I went to, which is kind of special. So that's kind of just quick about me and what I do. But I want to make this space helpful and for you all. You've got Jack there, who's a board member of CEPAD, so he probably is more of an expert than I am. But I don't know if you wanted me to get into about CEPAD, a bit of their history, how they've transformed over the years, and some of what they're currently doing, or are folks already aware of that? What direction would be helpful?
Yeah, I'd hoped you'd talk a little bit about that, as well as about your sense of some of the history of our particular partnership with CEPAD up in Quilombe. Froze up a second. Can you hear us? Tracey? I don't know if that's us or her.
Probably her. It started raining again in California.
Maybe.
Energy crisis in there.
You'll think about any questions you might have.
Tracy's being generous. She knows much, much more about CEPAD. Robert knows much, much more about CEPAD than I do, or probably ever will.
Let's see if she's going to log back in. So you're looking at ourselves.
That's painful.
Good looking at me.
We've always been looking
It
at
is
you
a
guys,
good
it's all right. Well, I did client management for a long time. I've been out of that for like the past 6 years or so. So the short answer is that it's an employee benefits and doing client management. Yeah. Otherwise, I get into a bunch of companies and roles that don't make any sense. I am. Yeah, I've been working for Blue Cross of North Carolina, and just not, and great people, great team. So it's kind of hard to make that change, but I get the sense this place hires well, people stay. Really good.
Did you text her?
Yeah, she says she's trying to reconnect.
That's right.
Yeah, I say I'm energized.
Yeah.
It's hard to change. I've been at Blue Cross 14 years. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yes, she is.
Oh, it's horrible.
Are you going to do a lingo?
Yeah, I'd do it. I'm not
The little
I'm not
bird.
consistent. Yeah, unfortunately.
All right. Sorry about that. Not sure what it was. I'm hotspotting through my phone now. I think the internet went down in my house. So, wait,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you heard what my question was
Yeah.
about just if you would be willing to share briefly about a little bit about the history of CEPAD and kind of how it's evolved in recent years, and then anything that you'd like to share in particular about what you know about our partnership in Quilombe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So as I said earlier, CEPAD just wrapped up the culmination of their 50th anniversary celebration. They were founded in 1972. The end of 1972, there was a major earthquake that had really devastated the capital city of Managua. And Dr. Gustavo Parajon, who was a Baptist pastor, when he saw the need, there was, I don't have the numbers off at the top of my head, but there were like 100,000 people left homeless as the homes were just destroyed. And so Dr. Parajon invited other churches to join him in providing some emergency relief, which were things like providing hot breakfast every morning for those who were left homeless. And I'm sure include just organizing, collecting of donations and distribution and things like that. And they did that for several months as people began to recover from the effects of the earthquake. And they said, and then as people were getting settled, Dr. Parajon said, okay, that was a great effort. Thank you. But all the other pastors who had participated in that were just said, no, we can't stop now. It was so great working together to serve the community. Let's keep going. And so they changed from a disaster assistance to more long-term development work. And it's very unique that that CEPAD has always been, and it began as an ecumenical effort, which in the region of Central America is actually quite unique. The churches don't tend to collaborate across denominations, but this example in Nicaragua of getting so much done, being able to serve well together, really left an imprint on the churches in Nicaragua and inspired them to continue working. So they grew to be quite a mighty development organization and a reference point. Dr. Gustavo Parajon had quite the vision, and they began working in rural communities where they were invited in to do development work. They also, one important role they played during the 1980s, during the Civil War there, was they did a lot of peace and reconciliation work. They trained community leaders to be, oh, my brain isn't working right now. The word is escaping me. To be reconcilers in a sense. I can't. Frozen again.
We can still see you and hear you. It's just it's not freezing up, but it's kind of anyway, just keep going. You're doing okay. We got you.
The word came to me. So they organized peace commissions. And so that was an important role that CEPAD played during the 80s. And Dr. Parajon was actually recognized for the important peace building work that CEPAD had done during the 80s, during that time of bringing communities together oftentimes communities were divided. They were on both sides of the conflict, but they were able to work together and see that, this war that was happening out there doesn't necessarily need to impact us in our communities. And they would actually put a stop to fighting in some of the rural communities because they said, we don't need to be impacted by this. And they is just a really powerful example. And I think, and I mention this because I think what has been so important about the role of CEPAD is that they work really at the grassroots, at the community level, organizing communities to take, to be empowered to have agency and to make change according to what they see as the needs that they want to, and the changes they want for their communities. And so currently, CEPAD really has become an expert in community development work, and they work for a 5-year cycle in circuits of communities. So they are currently in 48 different communities in 7 different departments of the country. And so in these communities, they are invited in. And then during that 5-year cycle, they do leadership development work, which consists of helping the community to organize themselves. And they will nominate a community development committee, a CDC, they call it. And then that committee will then respond to and represent the needs of the community. And at the goal is that at some point they will, they as a community or together with the other communities, and I'll get into that because that's sort of the what's happened in Quilam Bay with the work of CEPAD there. They can then advocate for community needs, like if they need electricity to be brought into their community, or road repairs, or maybe the community wells, things that the government might be able to provide for them, but it's kind of like the squeaky wheel. If they organize and make their voices heard, then a response can be, is more likely to come to be able to bring some of these changes into their community. They also do, along with that just basic community organizing work, they have a women's economic empowerment program that includes gardening, community banking, where they will organize women to come together to kind of pool their resources and support one another with that. They have an entrepreneurship program where they might provide some seed money. for small businesses that will help women have more independence, and patio projects, which would be providing training and then small animals. So between the gardening and the patio project, that really helps with both economically, but also the nutritional intake of the families and the women run those gardens. Alongside that, they also focus on food security and care for the environment. So when they enter a community, the other kind of training, they will, in each community, they will train at least 5 farmers. And those five farmers are taught how to stop using chemical fertilizers, so more natural organic farming methods, diversifying their crops, and how to use water more efficiently. Central America and Nicaragua is really seeing the effects of climate change with dry seasons and wet seasons, and it really impacts their ability to grow food for themselves. And so these techniques that they're learning are really a way that they are adapting to climate change in Central America or Nicaragua. And so normally when they enter a community and begin working, the farmers there are usually just growing staples like corn and beans. But by the time that 5-year cycle is over, most of the farmers by that time are growing up to a variety of like 25 different fruits, vegetables, grains, and even some trees that can be used for wood in the future, shade and different kinds of things like that. And in that model, the 5 farmers that are taught intensively with the CEPAD program are then tasked with training 5 other farmers. And so it's sort of kind of a pass it on model where that knowledge is grown. And usually the first 5 are ones that are willing to take the risk and try something different. And then the ones that follow are ones who are seeing the impact and seeing the positive change in what's happening on their land. And so it kind of catches on and really can transform the individuals and their families and the communities around them. So that's really, when we talk about what CEPAD does, that's what they do in the communities, is this really holistic transformation but then they put that back in the hands, the community has this knowledge and can implement these changes and transform their lives, but then they're also able to take that beyond. So when I mentioned they work in 48 communities and 7 departments, and each of those departments, the communities, about like 6 to 7 communities are in a circuit. So they're all near each other and are able to also collaborate and coordinate together to be able to think about broader needs around them. I mentioned road repair. That is the thing that is really important for the economic well-being of a community, to be able to have easy access, especially to be able to sell their products and things like that. And so improving roads is a piece that people often ask for, because sometimes and up in like Quilombe, where it's quite remote, if the roads aren't decent in the rainy season, you can get stuck, and that is problematic. Beyond that community development work, CEPAD also has a radio station, which is an important place for them to stay connected with the communities. And then the other piece of CEPAD, which I see it as their ministry to us, they have their International Volunteers Partnership and Delegation Program. And that really began in the 80s. There were a lot of US folks traveling to Central America, traveling to Nicaragua to understand what was really happening, because Nicaragua was in the news and we didn't know really what was happening. And so that kind of truth telling, to come and see what the US financed war was doing on the ground level, and to be able to come back to the States and say, this is what I saw, this is what I heard, this is what the people are asking for us. The Presbyterian Church actually played a really important role in the 80s of doing advocacy work to end the financing of the wars in Central America. And that's been an important part, I think, of our involvement in Central America and our connection there. But out of these visits to Central America in the 80s, that deeper connection and desire to build relationships and be in community with people birthed this partnership program that CEPAD offers as a way for folks to not just come and see for a week, but to come and see and make connections and build relationships that last more than a week, that last years. And how long has your partnership been going now, Robert?
I think since 05.
05. Okay. Yeah. So that's your 18, same year I began as regional liaison.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. And so I think these partnerships are really important, both for the US participants, but also for the Nicaraguan communities. I think about Dr. Gustavo Parajon, who founded CEPAD back in 1972. When I first began working in CEPAD in 99, it was right after Hurricane Mitch had wreaked havoc on Nicaragua. And so there were many, many teams coming down to do rebuilding work and reconstruction work after the devastation of the hurricane. And a lot of people would ask the question, was it worth the cost? Wouldn't it be better just to send the money that we are spending on plane tickets and travel and all of that to be able to make a difference in the communities? And Dr. Parajon talked about the importance of hope and not to underestimate the value of hope. And that our coming into the communities and spending time with community members is a source of hope. Some of these rural communities feel unknown to the rest of the world. And so to have the relationships with communities and churches from the US helps them feel seen and understood. And that is a source of hope. And as I said, we can't underestimate the value of that. And so just sending money doesn't build relationships. And the relationships really is a significant part and kind of the goal in and of itself of the partnership program. We do want to see improvements and differences, and you can discern that together and figure out ways to do that with your partner community. But I just got off of, in January, I was at a Honduras Mission Network conference. And the Hondurans, we were talking about the history of the relationship there over the last 15 years. And even though we talked about a lot of projects that had happened over the last 15 years, what we got to was this place where the Hondurans said, we asked them, what do you, what does the future hold? What are our hopes for the future? And the Hondurans very clearly said, we just want more time together. We want to spend time together. And I would suspect that your partners in Quilambé would have that same kind of hope for the partnership. I think they're probably really excited to be receiving you all this summer. And that's what they want. They just want to spend time with you all and get to know you, and you get to know them. And it's a really unique opportunity, I think, when you, as those of you who haven't been, you will experience it's off the beaten path, and it's not luxury accommodations, but the hospitality that you will receive is beautiful. And they will give you the best of what they have. And it's humbling, and sometimes it's hard to accept. But I think it's something really special, and a unique experience. I don't know. I can go on and on, but I'd love to hear questions and have a conversation.
Yeah.
So if CEPAD has been in these communities since 2005, how have you measured those 5-year cycles to kind of, so now you've got 15 years worth of outcomes?
Yeah, and actually that I need to clarify then. So once CEPAD completes the 5-year cycle in the circuit of communities, they actually then move on to a different set of communities. So CEPAD has not been directly involved in Quilambe. I'm not sure what the cycle.
I don't know when they officially ended their initial 5-year cycle. I do know that they've not had direct involvement other than when they've taken us, and that we always have a CEPAD representative to help facilitate our time there. When they had the recent hurricanes, CEPAD was directly involved in helping with the relief efforts there. But in terms of the 5-year cycle of development work, that probably officially had ended long before I even went in 2012. I think it was probably earlier on than that, and maybe it was just prior to that it had ended.
CEPAD would have begun working in that area well before 2005, I would think. If the DCPC became involved in 2005, their development would have been along
prior to that.
Yeah.
Probably a few years, I would guess,
Yeah.
because they had already established the CDC and ASDEC, yeah, and all that.
Yeah. So, but you know, the question you ask is sort of how do you measure, and I think that been asked of CEPAD a lot, and I don't know if they necessarily have done the research or have the data to be able to say, you know, after the 5 years, usually they are kind of on call for a couple years to be a consultant and help. Oftentimes, like ASDEC is the association of, I forget what it all stands for, but it's like the CDCs, the community development committees of each of the communities joined together in an association for probably the development of Quilambe or something like that is what it probably stands for. And so CEPAD promoters that work in Jinotega, which is close to there, would be able to be a consultant and help them, but it wouldn't be nearly as intensive or as direct. And I don't think CEPAD has really gone back to the communities where once they wrap up work to see, you know, 10 years later, how much is still happening? How many of these programs, how much fruit are we still seeing? Or does it just kind of die down? Is there a need for ongoing accompaniment? I think those are important questions. One of the benefits of the partnership program, like the one that you all have with Quilambe, is that it does continue their tie to CEPAD. And so Anita Taylor, who is of the delegations and partnership program, she when preparing for your trips and facilitating your partnership, does visit and does maintain communication with those communities, whereas other circuits of communities who don't have partnerships might not have that ongoing relationship. But I would suspect that because of that ongoing relationship with CEPAD that has been kept alive because of the partnership, then with the 2 hurricanes, Eta and Iota, that passed through was that in 2020 or 21?
2020, November of 2020.
November of 2020. So that because there was still that connection there, then CEPAD said, yeah, we will respond. We will. And that's one thing I see about CEPAD is that they are a network of communities. And a lot of communities where CEPAD has been will say that we are CEPAD. They don't say that CEPAD worked with us. They'll say we are CEPAD. They take ownership of that identity. And so there are other opportunities for those connections, but I really believe that the partnerships is what has kept them connected to CEPAD, that then allowed them to benefit from like the disaster assistance that happened. And CEPAD organizes a lot of that, the funding to be able to respond to disasters, both COVID related ones and hurricane related ones and whatnot. In part because of money that comes in a lot from the partnerships, but also Presbyterian Disaster Assistance has been able to step in and contribute to some of these other efforts. But that doesn't really answer your question, because I don't know if we know the answer to that of, 10 years after CEPAD leaves a community, can we see a difference? Is that diversification of crops still happening? I would love to know the answer to that.
Yeah, that may be a question. If we don't have an opportunity to talk with a CEPAD representative before our trip, that's definitely a question we should ask when we're there. Tracey?
And I would ask both CEPAD officials in Managua maybe, or in Jinotega, but also ask your community. You could ask them, where do you think you would be today had you not had CEPAD accompany you?
Yeah, that's a great question. You mentioned a few of the things that they do specifically. I know they've also gotten into some projects with water purification and I don't know how much they specifically focus on education. That's been an important piece to our partnership. And I assume that came directly from the communities where they expressed a concern that their children were not staying in school or not able to stay in school. And we devised this process by which we would provide incentives for them to have their children stay in school. I don't know if that works the same way in other partnerships or not.
Yeah, a couple other partnerships also do, but I think they're all slightly different. One of the more robust ones is in the Giddings Lovejoy Presbytery outside St. Louis area. With their community of Plan Grande Dos, they have a pretty robust scholarship program that began with helping kids stay in school and then allowing them to be able to go to high school in a neighboring town. And then it actually has expanded to finance some university students. And the exciting thing there is to see some of those students now coming back to their communities as teachers or as nurses, and being part of those communities. I hear from a lot of different sources that investment in education is really the best way to make a long-term difference in the lives of people wherever they are. And it's not easy and straightforward, and it can get complicated, but I do think it's worthwhile. CEPAD doesn't directly work in education in the community, but have a that's just a set that they have. I think it's also, I think when we think about what role CEPAD plays in the communities, the government, I think the quality of the education can be debated, but I believe that there are more more access to schools today than there were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And it really is the government's responsibility to provide education. And so I think that's why CEPAD isn't necessarily directly providing education, though or even building schools, because that would be the responsibility of the government. But they might work with, and I've heard of communities where they've organized to say, we need a school in our community. Just similar to like the road repairs or bringing in electricity. In some places, it was about bringing schools in. I'm getting messages that my internet is unstable again, so hopefully it's working.
We're still with you. It's gotten a little bit stop and go, but we can still hear you.
Yeah.
Other questions? I've got some other questions, but I'd love for you all to ask anything that is on your mind.
Yeah. What's the current relationship between CEPAD and the government? There's been a lot of talk about the government closing down NGOs. CEPAD has always had a very good relationship with the government. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I think the number of the amount of NGOs that have been shut down in about the last year is around 3,000 now. But to be fair, I think it's important. I've gone through and looked at whenever a list is published of organizations that are being shut down, many of them have been defunct for years. The last time they submitted their paperwork to update their board members or turn in their minutes and kind of fulfill all the things you need to do to maintain good standing as an association. They hadn't done those for 10, 15, 20 years. So a lot of these organizations were in essence not really functioning anyway. So I think you can turn it around and say, oh, look, you can either say the government shut down 3,000 organizations and is out to get civil society this way or that way, or you can see that they've been cleaning the books and trying to get things in order. I think it's a bit of both. I think they have been cleaning the books and trying to get things in order, but I also think they have targeted particular organizations that were doing really important work, but might not have been 100% supportive of government if they were expressed any criticism and those kinds of things. You're likely to get shut down. So it's a little bit of both, and it's complicated that way. CEPAD has the latest, and you never really know what the updates are, but my understanding is that CEPAD has been given kind of a verbal green light to continue to operate as an organization. They turn in their paperwork. They've been trying to update their certifications and authorizations to function as a non-governmental organization, but the government goes through everything with a fine-tooth comb, and the requirements for accounting are very tedious and very cumbersome, and they're having to go back years to justify and explain any money that's come in and what it was spent on and things like that. So it's become very, very cumbersome. And every time they go thinking they're going to get the certification, the government comes back and says, no, you need this or you need that. In my personal opinion, I think that is on purpose of the government, that they don't really want to give them the full stamp of approval. Not that CEPAD would then start joining the opposition and becoming something else, but because the government, if you are beholden to the government, you're going to stay in line and you're not going to make waves. And I think CEPAD has been really careful about being neutral by not speaking out or criticizing the government for anything, because they know that would put them at risk. But there are people within CEPAD who really believe in this government and really support this government, and they So if anything, I think those kinds of relationships have allowed them to continue to function. And then when you look at the really transformational work that they're doing in communities, I understand why they want to keep their mouth shut, why they don't want to make waves, because if they were to speak out, if they felt they wanted to, they would be putting at risk the work that they do in the communities. So they're able to continue to function, and that's how they want to keep it. But they don't actually have all their paperwork up to date, because it's just kind of a hamster wheel of requirements that seems never ending. And I don't know if or when they will actually be able to say, oh, we've got our certificate, which they're able to function and it works, but it impacts other things that aren't in the end that consequential. But for example, John and Ian, who are our mission coworkers placed with CEPAD, are not able to apply for residency, because if they were to do that, they would need all the paperwork from CEPAD because they're assigned to work with CEPAD would be their backers for their residency. But because CEPAD doesn't actually have their current certificate, John and Ian aren't able to apply for residency. So they have to come and go every 3 months. They have to leave the country and then come back in to be able to maintain proper migration status. In the same way, I actually still have my residency in Nicaragua, and I've been wanting to cancel it, but I'm under CEPAD's umbrella, and I can't even turn in paperwork from CEPAD saying that if I were to renounce my residency, I'd have to have a letter from CEPAD, and CEPAD doesn't have their certificate. So I also cannot quit my residency. It's very complicated and silly, but again, those things are kind of inconsequential. I think the important thing is that they're able to continue working in the communities, and that's what's most important to them.
That's all right. Nice to see some of your family.
Yeah.
Did that get it?
Yeah.
To your
A
question?
really long-winded answer to your question, sorry.
I'm curious, Tracey, if you could share with us a little bit about what, given your, I don't know, when's the last time you were there?
November.
Okay, same as us. But you've been in touch with people pretty regularly.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would recommend that we be doing specifically to prepare to be there, given the things that you know that are happening? And is there anything that you know of that we should particularly avoid, given what you know about what's happening there, culturally, socially, politically?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know if I have an easy answer to that, but I was thinking, as I was talking to Valdir França, is the area coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean with World Mission. So he's my boss, and he was in Nicaragua just last month. He went for the culmination of the 50th anniversary, or 150, can't think right, 50th anniversary. I just spent 3 days at Disneyland, who's celebrating their 100th anniversary. So, and we were talking about some of those kinds of questions. And I was thinking about, CEPAD is really desiring teams to start coming more frequently. In part because that's what they do and they want to host it, but it's also an important revenue stream for them to be able to finance the work that they do in the communities. So the loss of visiting teams that started with the social unrest in 2018 and then really got hit hard with COVID in 2020. That's just now starting to pick up. They're just really anxious for that to happen again, because economically it's been difficult for them. But as we were talking about the important development work that is happening and how lives are being transformed. And we as Presbyterian World Mission want to keep that alive and want that to happen. And we would love teams to have those experiences and visit. But at the same time, given the political context, we know that teams that visit CEPAD are going to see and experience part of the reality of Nicaragua, but they're not going to be able to ask certain questions, and they're not going to maybe be told certain experiences of people who might not be supportive of the government, who might be critical of the government. Those voices aren't going to be shared and aren't going to be heard when you're in Nicaragua. And so we were discussing how do we make sure that the visiting teams have kind of the whole story. And so I think these kinds of meetings where you're able to we can discuss freely and ask questions and talk about the political and social and economic situation in Nicaragua. I think maybe both before and after the visit in a safe, secure setting like this is important, both as before and I think after, to be able to kind of process what did we hear, what did we see, because it's interesting, like on February 9th, I don't know if you're all aware, there were 222 political prisoners in Nicaragua that were freed all at once. And the government in Nicaragua had arranged with the US government to receive these 222 prisoners. And so they were taken to the airport in the wee hours of the morning and boarded onto a plane and flown to Washington, D.C. These 222 political prisoners, many of whom had spent nearly 2 years in prison, were, that sense of to all of a sudden be free was joyous and wonderful, but they also learned that they had been stripped of their Nicaraguan citizenship. So they were now stateless beings, which is a very complicated place to be in this world. And there's just a lot of things to unpack about that. During that day that was happening, I was glued to my phone and to the news trying to get information about who was on that flight, what conditions they were in, watching on YouTube different news feeds of people at Dulles Airport waiting for them to arrive, and just really wrapped up in that news. That day around, it was probably about 2:00 in the afternoon Nicaraguan time. And I was texting with John and Ian, preparing for doing some other unrelated work. And I mentioned to them about this prisoner release. And they had no idea. They had been sitting in CEPAD's offices all day long and had no clue that this was happening, because at CEPAD, they do not discuss politics. It is not a safe space to talk about political prisoners or any kind of criticism of the government. And so it was just really telling to me that it wasn't even mentioned, this like major news that was impacting Nicaragua. So being in the offices of CEPAD was this kind of sheltered space. And so John and Ian, in order to find out what was happening, had to go home, and there's no news channel on the TV where you're going to get this information either. They had to go to YouTube to be able to access independent media that would talk about what was going on. And so you really could go to Nicaragua and not experience the whole spectrum of perspectives and what's going on. But I don't think it would be a good idea for you all to try and access all those perspectives either while you're there. I think the most important thing is to listen. And what are you hearing and what are you not hearing? I think the fact that John and Ian did not hear about the political prisoners says a lot. And so I think regardless of what people's perspectives are, people are very wary to share and to talk. And to an extreme at this point. I remember when I first moved to Nicaragua in 1999, one thing that really impressed me about Nicaragua was the open political debate that happened. We would be in a restaurant and people would be criticizing the president or making fun of him or talking about how these development programs of the government were just hot handouts to buy votes. And there was just a lot of real debate and analysis that happened openly among people, regardless of what side you were on. And I can't have a good practice. I can't remember, as I said, I can't pinpoint the day or the year, but I'd say soon after Daniel Ortega came back into the presidency in 2006 or 7, I remember starting to think before I said what I thought. I remember looking over my shoulder and trying to figure out who else was within earshot before I discussed politics. And so it was sort of this slow erosion of that freedom of expression, that freedom of open debate that today is absolutely non-existent. And I think that is a survival mechanism because of the persecution that the government has against people. And there are a lot of Nicaraguans in exile today, a lot who have chosen to leave, some for economic reasons, some for political reasons. I was just looking up the numbers, which to me are just astonishing. But in 2017, so before any of this open civil unrest began, there were 1,721 Nicaraguans who crossed into the U.S. unauthorized or were caught by Border Patrol coming into the U.S. 1,721, 30 of whom were seeking asylum. That was in 2017. In 2022, that number was 165,000 Nicaraguans that came into the U.S.
Third largest group, I believe.
Yeah. So it's
Tracey, the U.S. had a very open posture towards those folk from Nicaragua, at least for a long time. Has that changed recently?
My understanding is that within the past couple of months, that has changed. So the end of 2022, there was a massive wave of Nicaraguans. And when I was there in November, that is all I heard about was so-and-so is getting on a bus tomorrow. So-and-so is on their way. This person, that person, there were bus loads leaving every single day. Because when they turned themselves in at the border, they were given parole and they were able to stay in the country. And I know many people who are kind of in that, that are in that current status. My understanding is that the borders aren't as open as they were just a couple months ago, but they have changed and they now are implementing a humanitarian parole for Nicaraguans. And so, for example, these 222 prisoners that were released in February, the U.S. Embassy put out a communication knowing that any family members of those 222 prisoners that were still in Nicaragua were at risk. And they said, if you have a valid passport, come apply for humanitarian parole. And they've been issuing parole. And I actually have a good friend whose wife and 2 of his children came to the US in October of last year, paid the coyote and did that whole trek, and and they're now living in Indianapolis. But their father, my friend, found a sponsor in the US and applied and has just been granted travel authorization to come to the US under humanitarian parole. And so I don't know what the exact numbers are, but that is an option that exists now that didn't exist a few months ago.
And are those Nicaraguan citizens having to are those
Sorry about that. Can you repeat the question?
no, that's okay. Are those Nicaraguan citizens having to bypass the border patrol? Or are they able to leave through the,
You mean the Nicaraguan?
Nicaraguan seeking refuge, if they've gotten parole or if they're just trying to
How do they get out of the
Are
country?
they able to leave on their
Nicaragua.
own or secretly?
Yeah, my understanding is that they are. My friend who's going to be traveling in a couple weeks is going to be flying out of Costa Rica. And I think it's basically because the airfare is cheaper from there. Actually, I don't know. I need to verify that, but I think they are able to leave. I think the government the Nicaraguan government has a bit of an attitude of good riddance. Like, if you're not with us, we don't need you or want you here. But there are people who do need to, for example, this friend of mine, when his wife left, she did have an arrest warrant out against her for some participation in protests in 2018. And so she was, she had to leave through what they call a blind spot on the border. So she avoided the immigration and then traveled with her Nicaraguan ID, but in the other countries of Central America, it was not an issue. But to leave Nicaragua, she had to do it clandestinely.
So if people are leaving in that way, they probably don't have any hopes of returning or plans of returning, at least not under this government.
Correct.
Okay.
And like the national newspaper that I was reading that they had to leave in the middle of the night and through those blind spots. That was last fall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the from La Prensa, a lot of journalists have been targeted by this, and oftentimes they're kind of a name will come up as someone that they're seeking, and then you kind of leave in the dark of night. And I know many people who have had to do that.
Yeah. So they don't have that national newspaper. Is it still running, or is the Ortega administration now purchasing and kind of owning most of the press?
My understanding is there are no print newspapers in Nicaragua today. So La Prensa is, they ended up actually, after they did get taken over and kind of shut down, they were having a hard time operating because the paper was being held up in customs for a long time. And there was just a lot of different issues. And then it was kind of outright persecution and they were shut down, though they do continue to operate online. The same thing with, like, there's a news station called Confidencial. They do kind of like a 60 Minutes program, a news program once a week. And that has been broadcast on YouTube for the past 4 or 5 years because no local channels are permitted to show that. So any kind of, what was that?
Confidencial.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to recommend a news source that you feel like is accurate and as non-biased as possible?
I don't know if that exists for Nicaragua.
What do you use as your source of news?
I mean, Confidencial, I mean, I trust Confidencial, but I think if you talk to someone who was supportive of the government, they would say that they are biased. There's another page, website called Havana Times that publishes, basically they translate a lot of Confidencial's articles into English. So if you don't speak Spanish, that would be a source. But you know, you're going to get one extreme or the other. It's hard to find those who are in the middle.
Yeah.
It's a difficult place. Being in the middle is a very difficult place, and it's heartbreaking. Yeah, and it's more complicated than the two extremes, I think, project it to be. But I think there are other sources of analysis that are worthwhile, that kind of are more than just sort of the short articles, but I would recommend like WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America Working Group, LAWG, NACLA, NACLA. Those are going to be longer, deeper analysis pieces. Those are organizations that work on, you know, advocacy for around U.S. policy towards Latin America. So they're going to be critical of the U.S., but they're also, I think, a lot of those organizations are standing on the side of democracy. And I think that's the concern, is that we see a total erosion of democracy in Nicaragua, and it's a trend. It's happening throughout the region and around the world. Similar things in different ways are happening in El Salvador that are very concerning today. And I think we have reason to be concerned about, you know, the strength of democracy in our own country. And so I think these are important things to be asking about. You know, in those who support the government would say that they're willing to, well, I mean, they might not necessarily admit that democracy has eroded, but they would say that serving the poor, that providing for the needs of the poor people in Nicaragua is worth everything else we've given up. I mean, they wouldn't phrase it that way, but I think that's what that's kind of where they say, is that the government is taking care of the people. The government is taking responsibility and providing for the needs of the people. And that's what they see, rather than seeing people fleeing because they feel like they don't have a voice, that they don't have, they can't be critical. They don't see the need for people to be critical. And they also, I think those who support the government or the government line also looks at kind of world order politics and labels the US as an empire that is trying to control. And so anything that is anti-empire, anti-US is the discourse that they're going to give. And so the 2018 uprising, you know, depending on who you ask, it was either a spontaneous response to growing authoritarianism by the people of Nicaragua, led by students, or it was a US funded attempted coup. And I think I was there. It felt very spontaneous. Did the US try to kind of have some influence in certain key players once this started growing and building? Probably yes. But to say that it was a US sponsored and financed coup takes away all agency of Nicaraguans who are thoughtful, critical people who saw problems happening in their country and wanted to make a change. So it's complex.
Questions?
What would the Nicaragua, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No.
Just to go to something a little more lighthearted, what would Nicaraguan people, how do they identify themselves? What's their source of pride about their country?
Nicaraguans, I think, are a joyful people. They really like to laugh a lot. One thing I learned over the years is that Nicaraguans will always tell a punchline twice. I'm married to a Nicaraguan, so I know this to be true.
It's hilarious.
Family is extremely important. I think there's a Nicaragua. I mean, there's a lot of pride about being Nicaraguan, and they're really, this is probably a silly example, but there's what's his name? Norchad Omir on the Miami Hurricanes.
Yeah.
They unfortunately lost last night in the semifinals, but he graduated from high school from Bluefields, Nicaragua. And my husband has become a Hurricanes fan because he's so proud that there's a Nicaraguan who made it all the way to the semifinals in March Madness. It's been really fun
He's one of their
to
stars.
watch. Yeah.
They're big baseball fans too.
Oh, big baseball fans. Yeah. And they've got a couple players in the major leagues right now. Don't ask me who they are. My husband could tell you. But I think, what else can I say about Nicaraguans? It's a beautiful country. It really is. The variations of green in the rainy season is just lush and beautiful and just amazing. You've got the lakes and the volcanoes. The last couple of times I've gone with my family to Nicaragua, we've taken time to just explore different corners of the country, and it really has so much to offer, and people are very proud of that.
Maybe you can help us. I haven't told CEPAD definitively. We have a couple of options for our final day coming back from Quilambe. And one option is to go to the lagoon. What's the name of it? Laguna de Apoyo, which we've done before, or to stop and stay a night at Selva Negra and in Matagalpa, and then come back the next day. So those, I'm sure, are both. I mean, I've never been to Selva Negra. I've heard a lot about it and seen some pictures, but I think that's what we're leaning towards, but I don't know if you would recommend.
Yeah, they're both great options, but very different in the sense that Selva Negra would be a chance to do some hiking. They do some coffee production there, so you might be able to get to see some of that as well. Nicaraguans will say it's cold, it's cooler, it's up in the mountains, and the air can be crisp in the evenings. Laguna de Apoyo, if you're going to spend the day there, it would be a chance to go swimming and just kind of relax and enjoy the beauty. But Selva Negra is really a beautiful area too. If you like hiking, there's some great trails through the forest there. Be an interesting option.
Well, we've taken a lot of your morning, afternoon. Any last questions before we say thank you? And we're grateful for you taking time with us. Any last words you want to leave with us before we close this time together?
No, I think I just think it's great that you're really taking the time to prepare. The trip's a few months away, but to have this time to build your team together and to ask questions, and count on me as a resource. If you need me to answer specific questions or join you again, just let me know. Estoy a la orden, as we say in Spanish.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Grateful for your sharing this time with us and sharing your not only your the information, but your passion for Nicaragua and your work. So peace be with you and your family. And I hope that you say you've just come off of spring break.
Yep.
So
Back to the grind tomorrow.
I hope that the transition back to normal routines will go smoothly.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Hasta pronto.
Ciao.
Ciao. All right. Stop the recording.